When it comes to Arsenal, of course, there's the Ivan Toney situation. There's been talks this week from Sasha Tavernieri that they're intensifying talks surrounding Onana. He personally believes that deal is going to happen. What's your understanding of the latest in relation to Arsenal? Their fans are desperate for some new signings and new bodies this January. Has there been any movement on those deals or any others in the past 7 days, Ben?
Nothing really for Arsenal. I don't think that will change unless somebody leaves. So Eddie Nketiah still seen as part of Arsenal's plans, despite the fact that Crystal Palace and a few other clubs are looking. And the valuation of Nketiah is relatively transparent, talking to sources, something in the region of 30 to 35 million. But it's not just about money. It's about the fact that Arsenal finished last season lacking depth. It was defensive depth due to Saliba's injury, and they wobbled and they didn't get over the line. They're in a reasonably similar position at roughly the halfway stage of the season, but the difference is there's way more suitors. And as Tottenham have shown, you can jump from first to fifth in the Premier League in the space of just a couple of games. So Arsenal don't have the same cushion, and they're not even top at this stage, but they're in the title race. I think that is absolutely fair to say. Man City, for me, are still the favourites. And I think Liverpool are favourites to finish above Arsenal, but I think it's going to be really tight. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's only 4 or 5 points between first and third, even first and fourth, potentially. So every point matters and depth is vital. And if Arsenal let Nketiah go, they need to replace him. So it's going to be really difficult with financial fair play for Arsenal to do anything. Toney, again, I think has been prematurely spoken about, because he feels like, as he's now said on record and as I've reported in the past, he feels that he's given a lot to Brentford and has got, due to the gambling ban, a fair amount back in return. So there's maybe some repayment needed to Brentford. But as importantly as Toney's desire to maybe stick out the season at Brentford is the fact that Brian Mbeumo is injured and Johan Wissa's at the African Cup of Nations. So Toney returning in mid-January is vital for Brentford because they're moving in the wrong direction. And without him and his goals, they could easily get sucked into some kind of relegation battle. And I think that knowing that, Brentford will be even more bullish. So the number that Arsenal would require for Toney is minimum 80 million and potentially as high as 100 million. And that's not within Arsenal's budget. And it's all very neat to say, can't they just do what they did with David Raya and agree a structural deal, a loan with an obligation to buy that ends up suiting all parties? Well, guess what? That doesn't suit Brentford. Brentford need cash if they're to sell Toney. They need a replacement in January because of the 2 players that I've mentioned being injured and away. And they need to do all of that in the next 2 weeks. I just don't see it happening. I wouldn't rule out Toney even signing a new deal at Brentford, but I'd say the stumbling block to that is his wages. And I would also say that free agency, even in 2025, is not out of the question, because when Toney speaks of loyalty, I don't think he means just staying until the end of the season. I think he's very genuine in saying that there's a fair chance he stays at Brentford for even longer, whether that's free agency 2025 or whether that's a new deal with some kind of mechanism that still allows him to leave. So my understanding remains, as I've reported, that yes, Toney would welcome a move from Arsenal, more so than Chelsea. And for Chelsea, he's not necessarily top of their list, even though he's been discussed. But we still might have to wait a fair amount longer to resolve the Toney situation than in the next few weeks.
Yeah, it's a real interesting one, that, because it's the more you read the situation at Burnley. I even think with Brentford being in basically in a relegation battle because they're struggling, that makes it even harder. If they were sitting sort of 8th in the league, really comfortable, 10, 15 more points, it could be easier. But you look at the whole scenario, it looks really difficult right now. The other deal that's kind of come up in the last few days has been the Onana deal. It's been played down by a lot of journalists, and I understand why. What's your understanding surrounding this? Can you see Arsenal making this move for Onana in the next 20 days?
No, again, because of the same reason, cost. And even though people are stating rightly that Everton's finances are ropey and this investigation could have, depending on different permutations, various other repercussions, including compensation to other clubs that feel that they were impacted by Everton. The reality is right now Everton are appealing and they're hoping of getting their 10 points back, or at least some of them back. And they would be looking at something in the region of, I would say, 50, 55 million for Amadou Onana. And that's not really within Arsenal's plan. So unless they can exploit Everton's financial situation and get that price down, it's going to be really difficult. But I'm also not aware of any talks or advancement or offers between Arsenal and Amadou Onana. We know the admiration is there, and it's really easy to be window planning and names to come up. And it's also normal to discuss who's out there in the market. But at this stage, there's nothing more than that. This idea that Onana's agent, who is his sister, is starting talks, this idea that Arsenal are considering dropping 50 million, that's not accurate to my understanding. So I would be downplaying Onana to Arsenal at this stage. It's a long window. You can never rule anything out. In January, you sort of have, I would say, 3 stages that are very different to the summer. You have stage 1 that has parallels, where you've planned your business early because you know it's a short window, and then you announce it in the first few days. You got stage 2, where you move in the early days because you don't want to mess about. And that's what Spurs do. And that's the difference between the summer. Summer, you've got more time. So summer, you get a flurry of business that's pre-planned, but you don't really get a flurry of early negotiations because you don't have to show your hand. You maybe try a few more games. In January, you get a lot of Spurs type moves where you don't want to mess around. You want to get it done. Then you tend to have a lull because the mid-January football starts in the Premier League. Some players are off for AFCON and the Asian Cup. And after we get past about January the 14th, business slows a little bit. And that's an indication that clubs are not guaranteed to do business, which is why we've not seen Man U sign anyone, which is why we've not seen Chelsea move yet, which is why we've not seen Arsenal make any serious moves yet. Some of that is down to outgoings first, and some of that's down to the fact that the plan is just not that expansive for this mid-season window. And then you get into the final week and there's opportunism, there's last-minute buys, there's pivots. That can be down to results, that can be down to injuries, that can be down to waiting, and then coming at a club at the last minute to try and give them no time to think and get a deal done. So I think we're heading into a little bit of a lull. I think the lull's already started, even though Spurs obviously have got Dragusin over the line. And I think in the next week or so, clubs need to start showing their hand as we head into the final, 10, 12 days of the window. And that's when we might get a late flurry again. So I expect Arsenal to be relatively quiet. I think Liverpool will be quiet. I think that Chelsea will now pick up and show us their hand. We'll find out whether they're going to bring in a striker and a left back. The Conor Gallagher situation will obviously, as far as January is concerned, resolve itself one way or the other. We'll find out whether Newcastle are truly bound by financial fair play in Saudi Arabia. The Henderson situation needs to resolve itself one way or another. But beyond that, as far as either names that Premier League fans know about or Premier League clubs, I think that certainly compared to the last January when Chelsea went nuts, we're in for a relatively conservative window. I hope anyway, because then I can go and get some sleep.
It does feel that way. I mean, 10 days in, there's I was just going back and looking at videos from last January. There was so much more activity, so much more genuine noise surrounding these situations. And maybe clubs are a little bit more reluctant to not spend when they've seen what, there's punishments flying about for Everton and other clubs. Maybe people are realizing we better take this FFP thing seriously. We don't want a points deduction.